Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're talking about how to make your own natural wood finish at home. This is a pretty easy process, and the purpose of this video is not to tell you guys specifically, here's a recipe that works. It's going to be giving you guys the basis of making your own recipe, because that's the whole point with this process, is you want to find something that works best for you. And so that actually brings us to the point of why would you even want to make your own natural finish when you can just go to the store and buy one? Well, there's actually three pretty good reasons for this. The first off is that you have full control over what you want your finish to be. If you want a whole lot of protection, you can use more additives and waxes and whatnot to make a stronger finish. You want a paste wax for a top coat. If you want a gel finish so that it doesn't run down the side of things that are vertical. And even when we talk about these natural finishes, you can also start making your own natural stains. So you can really control the color and all that kind of stuff. That is something that I'm going to deal with in the future. Right now we're just talking about a normal wood finish. We're not going to be dealing with stains. This is just for a wood finish. Another good reason to make your own natural finishes at home is that it can save you a decent amount of money. A lot of your really good quality natural finishes use the exact same components that we're going to be using here. They just make their own proprietary mixtures, put it in a jar, and then sell it directly to you. Now, the caveat to that is that in the long term, this is cheaper. Initially, when you're going out and buying all your different ingredients and that, it is going to be probably more expensive than going to the store and buying a jar of whatever finish. But in the long term, when you go through and buy all the ingredients and you find a finish that you like, it can actually save you a decent amount of money. And the biggest thing here is that you're getting a high quality finish for the price of all of these individual little elements. Then the final point is that it's just a fun thing to do. Making your own wood finish, being able to tell people that you make your own kind of proprietary mixture of finish and whatnot, is just kind of a fun thing to add to an already custom piece of furniture. Now, of course, when we talk about natural finishes, it's also important to mention that these are never going to perform as well as something like Rubio Monocoat or Osmo Polling Soil. These modern finishes that use polymers and resins and that kind of stuff in their specific mixtures, those are always going to be tougher than any naturally forming element that's out there. But that's also why those specific finishes are very, very expensive. If you ever looked at the liter jar of Rubio Monocoat, that liter of Rubio Monocoat goes for about $300 Canadian. That is absolutely insane, and I could never personally imagine paying that much for a wood finish, but there are reasons that people do want to go for that. So when you set out to use natural finishes, just understand that there are all those limitations. You're never going to get something that has as much protection as like Rubio Monocoat, but you will still get a very good wood finish. So before we get into making our finish, we need to talk about safety, because if you don't follow this process properly, you do this in an unsafe manner, you could burn down your shop, cause permanent bodily damage to yourself, all these kinds of different things. So you want to make sure you are following these very simple safety guidelines. So to start off, make sure you know what you're working with. I know that I'm going to be basing my mixture on tung oil, which is a flammable oil. I know that I'm going to be using some citrus solvents, which are a poisonous substance in that mixture. Now you also have to consider what potential fumes are going to come from this too, because we're going to be heating up this mixture in order to melt things and mix them together. We want to be careful of what fumes we're creating. So that's why we're specifically using citrus solvents here, because the fumes that come off of citrus solvents are non-damaging to the human body. The fumes will enter your body, will be processed through your lungs, and will be excreted without any damage to your body. Whereas things like paint thinner, Varsol, naphtha, those other typical thinners used for oils can release some very, very toxic and dangerous fumes. So my recommendation, if you're using any form of thinner, only ever use citrus solvents, because they are natural and those fumes are not going to damage your body by breathing them in. Of course, I already mentioned that we're using tung oil, which is a flammable oil. That means that you should never, ever do this process over open flames. So that means propane stoves, gas stoves, anything like that. You do not want to be doing this over that open flame, because this oil has the potential to spill out of the container that we're going to be using to mix it in. So ideally, you want to be doing this on a glass stove top. That's what I found works the best. A closed hot plate also works really well, and you can buy those for about 30 bucks on Amazon. But either one of those options is going to be a good way to just keep yourself safe. You want to make sure that there's no open flames around this stuff. And the final point is you want to make sure you're using a double boiler to melt all of your ingredients together. So this is basically just a pot that sits inside another pot of boiling water. And the purpose here is just to keep your ingredients away from direct heat. Because again, things like tung oil can combust if they're introduced to direct heat. But it's also a case of your waxes and that are also going to melt a lot better if you work with a double boiler rather than introducing them to direct heat. So a double boiler is just a very safe method of both melting your waxes and dealing with your flammable oils. So now getting into our ingredients here. So there's three main components that are going to make up your mixture. So the first off is some kind of an oil. So in this case, I'm going to be using tung oil, but linseed oil, walnut oil, any of these other oils are going to work just fine. The big thing here is you want to make sure you're working with a curing oil, like an oil that is over time going to harden into a solid substance. So any of the oils that I mentioned are good options there. What you want to avoid is using something like mineral oil, because mineral oil will stay in its oily form for basically forever. It's never going to cure up. It's going to stay in the wood in that oily form, and it's not going to add any protection. Whereas the whole reason that things like tung oil and linseed oil have been used for centuries in woodworking is because that oil soaks into the wood and hardens within those fibers, and that's what actually adds in the protection. It's got nothing to do with the oil, it's just the fact that oil soaks into that wood and hardens, and that helps support the fibers around it. The next part is additives. So you can see here, these are the 3 additives that I'm going to be using in my own mixture. So we've got pine rosin, carnauba wax, and then beeswax on the end. Each of these different additives that I have here just add a different type of protection. Now, the additive side of this is just a massive category that is very challenging to get into, right? There's all kinds of different natural additives that you can mix into your combination here in order to add different levels of protection. You can even add coloration with different pigments and whatnot. All of this stuff can be very easily done with naturally occurring substances. But in this case, this is about the simplest form I can think of. So just to go over the 3 that I'm using here, pine rosin is going to add a very hard bottom layer. So basically how it's going to work is as the oil soaks into the wood, the pine rosin is a slightly thinner substance than the wax is. So the oil is going to soak into the wood, then the pine rosin is going to form that first layer, and then the wax is going to sit on top. Carnauba wax, which is our next one here, is the hardest naturally occurring wax on the planet. So that obviously makes it very good for protection. It's very commonly used in the automotive industry to help put like wax coatings on cars. It's a very good and well-known wax for adding protection. The only problem with carnauba wax is that because it's so hard, it's also very brittle. So if you were to just use carnauba wax in your mixture, you would end up with a very brittle top surface of that finish, and you'd have the potential for it to crack in the future. Then our final one here is beeswax. So the beeswax will help balance out the hardness of our carnauba wax. So by mixing those 2 waxes about 50-50 with each other, you end up with a more malleable surface. So you get the strength and the protection of the carnauba wax, but it's also not going to break and fracture as easily because of the softness of the beeswax. Now, this is all very technical. I'm not a chemist. Somebody else could probably explain this a lot better. I just know through the research that I've done, you want to mix these 2. You never want to just use carnauba wax. You always want to mix it with a slightly softer wax. For a long time now, I've been using tried and true original oil, which is just linseed oil and beeswax, and that's worked out just fine for me. So beeswax is a perfectly good additive, but if you want something that has a little bit more protection, that's where the carnauba wax comes in. Then the final component here is a thinner. So this is something that is going to help thin the overall substance, get it more to a consistency that you want. So the problem that you can run into very quickly is that it's very easy to make a paste wax. It's very hard to make an oil when you start mixing all this stuff together. Because as you start taking solids like waxes, pine resin, whatever, and mixing it into an oil, that oil is just going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. And oil already is a fairly thick substance. The thinner is going to help make the oil mixture a little bit thinner in general, and that way when you start adding those solids, you're going to help be able to create a little bit more balance. So if you want a paste wax, then you don't need to worry about adding in a thinner. But if you want something that's more of a gel or an oil especially, you're going to need that thinner mixed in there to help kind of thin things out and just overall make things flow a little bit better. Because again, as you add more solids, that overall mixture is just going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. So the first part of the process here is you want to start by making some random guesses. We know that overall, we probably want to mix our oil to solids in about a 10-to-1 ratio. So 10 parts oil to 1 part solids. We also know that with our beeswax and our carnauba wax, we want those to be at about a 50-50 to each other. We know that our pine rosin, we don't want a whole ton of that, all those kinds of things. We want to start with some of those good educated guesses. But overall, we're just going to kind of start mixing and seeing what happens, because nothing can really go wrong at this point, because you can always add more stuff later on to help balance out your mixture. The important thing as you're starting this process is, for one, start with small amounts. I like to start with tablespoon measurements because that's a very small amount, and it's very easy to add more of certain things later on down the road. The other part of this is that you want to take very, very good notes. Everything you add down to the exact measurement, you want to add that here. So whether you're going by weight, you're going by volume, whatever you're using as your measurement, you want to keep track of that with everything that you add. So once we have our basic idea of what we want to start our mixture with, we're going to start by adding everything to our double boiler. We're then going to add that double boiler to the boiling pot of water and let everything inside melt completely. We want to make sure everything is as dissolved and mixed together as possible. Then once you've reached that point where you can't see any solids anymore in that mixture, you want to just leave it on the boiler for about 5 minutes longer. And occasionally you want to go back through and stir it. This will just make sure that everything has an opportunity to fully melt and dissolve and mix together so that you end up with a actual mixture, not certain solids floating around in that oil. So once you've let that mixture sit for about 5 more minutes, you're then going to remove it from heat and just let it sit and fully cool down until it's not hot anymore. So you want to start by just doing the very simple visual analysis. Did you create a block of wax that's a little bit softer? Did you create a paste wax? Did you create a gel that's kind of, it's a little bit of, it's not quite liquid, it's not quite solid? Did you create a liquid? All these kinds of things. You want to figure out what kind of a mixture you've now created, because now you know that if you use those same measurements that you used in your first mixture, you're going to get that same result every single time. You can also take this time to take some samples and whatnot, because the big thing along this whole process is that you're just trying to figure things out. So just get a little bit of that wax on a paper towel, wipe it on a piece of wood, and make sure you keep that paper towel, because that paper towel will also tell you how hard and brittle your finish actually ends up being. The important thing here is you just want to collect as much information as you possibly can. And the big thing here is you want to figure out what your goal is for your finish. So if when your mixture cools down, you end up with just a solid block of wax, you then know that you need to add more oil or more citrus solvents in order to help thin that whole thing out. If you end up with basically just an oil, then you know that you need to add some more solids in order to get it to more of a gel or a paste wax stage. So if you're not happy with the mixture that you came out with, you can now go through and add more stuff to it to help create that mixture that you want. Put it back on the heat, let everything melt, mix and follow those same steps again, let it cool down, and reevaluate your mixture. And the cool thing here is that everyone who ever tries to make their own natural finish is probably going to end up with slightly different ratios, different numbers and whatnot, just based off of what they've tried and what's worked for them. And you just want to try out as many different mixtures and combinations of different ingredients until you find something that you're happy with and you actually want to try out on a piece of furniture. So as long as you follow that fairly simple process, you will eventually find a natural finish that does work for you. And the important thing to remember here is that every natural finish that you can go in and buy at a store is just a mixture that worked for somebody at some point in time. It's a random mixture of ingredients that worked for them in when they were trying to make their own finish. And again, I can't stress this enough, this is all about experimenting. You can make 10, 20 different types of finishes, all based off of different mixtures of ingredients in that, and you can test them out rigorously before you actually ever take them to a piece of furniture. So it's all about experimenting and just finding that finish that's gonna work for you. So if you guys have any questions about the process or any of the ingredients I talked about in this video, feel free to leave them in the comments down below and I will do my best to answer them. But as always guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one.